Hi there, everyone. So the other day, one of my posts on Instagram went viral. Well, subjectively so. Viral for me, I guess, compared to like true internet virality. This was more of like a mild infection. Too soon for jokes like that? Whatever. The point of the post was essentially to say that your beliefs, your religious beliefs, they don't come from God. They don't even come from the Bible. They come from your particular interpretation of the Bible. And I went on to talk about how there's no such thing as this unaffected, pure transference of information, like from the mind of God directly through this into your mind. People tend to think they can just pick up like an English Bible, they can read it, they can see what they find there, and they can just deduce, oh, now I clearly and plainly know what is truth. This is what the Bible says, which means this is what God says. Therefore, I believe this thing because God said it, and it's true because it's in the Bible, and it's in the Bible because God said it, and so on and so forth. And those of us with maybe some distance from this kind of thinking can kind of more easily see how circular the logic is. But, you know, like when you're in it, as I was for so many years, it doesn't feel like circular reasoning. It feels pretty straightforward. You know, God is the ultimate source of truth, and God wrote the Bible. Therefore, the Bible is the conveyor of ultimate truth. And all we have to do is to read it plainly, read it literally, accept what it says, and voila, we possess truth. Well, what I attempted to bring to the table with my post the other day was the idea that when you read the Bible, there are, I would say at minimum, two significant factors at play that should slow us down before we start claiming that we just believe a thing because the Bible says it and therefore our beliefs come straight from God. And the first factor is this: your English Bible, I'll keep holding this giant thing up, your English Bible is a translation of a translation of a translation and so on. And each act of translation is, by necessity, also an act of interpretation. So by the time Zondervan ships you your crisp new Bible, the pages that you hold and that you read are products of many, many interpretive moves. Decisions that were made tens, hundreds, thousands of years ago. Not only things like what actual books and letters and stories and poems, whatever, made the final cut, but also how they were sequenced, how they were edited, how they were translated, and so on. And the point here, I don't think, is all that complicated. It's just this: have some awareness and maybe some humility that lots of time and culture and humanity has passed between the writing of this thing and your reading of it. And for me, this means, among other things, that we shouldn't expect or assume that we are the recipients of this pure, unaffected, unaltered, non-biased thoughts of God. You know, if God sent us an email 2,000 years ago, that thing has gone through myriad security checks and layers of Google Translate and copied and pasted from floppy disks to CD-ROMs to USB drives before ever getting to you. Although that metaphor is kind of dumb because the preservation of digital assets is like 1,000,000 times more stable than the preservation of word-of-mouth stories written on parchment, hand-copied over centuries, passing through different cultures and languages and centuries of different eras of civilization. But it's fine. I'm good at bad metaphors. But so that's one factor. And then the second factor that I tried to point out is that not only is the Bible itself subject to like filters of multiple translations and interpretations, but you as the reader, me as the reader, we're also impacted by all sorts of things that we bring subconsciously to our experiences of reading the Bible. For instance, the kind of family that you grew up in. That's going to impact how you read and understand the Bible, whether your family went to church or not, what church you went to, what part of the world you grew up in. That's going to impact how you read the Bible. The time in history, the era that you know, if you were born in 1232 AD, your experience of reading the Bible, which you wouldn't even be able to do unless you were a priest because there wasn't Bibles for you back then. But if you could read a Bible, your experience of reading it is going to be vastly different because of where you live and the time you live than it is here in 2022. The experiences that you have in life, the kinds of suffering that you've endured. You can imagine the individual who has had lots of trauma in their life. They read stories and it's going to land with them very differently People who might have endured different kinds of suffering from maybe trusted figures in their life, they're going to have different conceptions of what it means for God to be a heavenly father, for instance. Things of that nature. Like, that's going to impact how people read the Bible. Of course it is. Your personality, what you tend to gravitate towards, what you tend to repel away from, how your brain processes things, that's going to impact how you read it. Like, all of these different factors are like, when you see in a movie or whatever, you see the inside of a cockpit of a spacecraft, and it's just this floor to ceiling like wall of dials and knobs and levers. It's like everything about you and where you grew up and how you grew up and how you sorry if I hit the microphone and it's making sounds. All of that are like the knobs being finely tuned uniquely for you and your own story and your own soul. And every time this little knob gets turned or that little lever gets flipped, it makes a subtle difference on how we digest the words on the page. So of course, your reading and understanding and interpreting of any given passage will inevitably be slightly different, or in some cases vastly different, than someone who grew up in a totally different kind of home or went to a different kind of church or experienced different kinds of things and so on. Okay, so in summary, the Bible is not a pure, sterile, unaffected object, and you are not just an abstract, objective, unbiased subject. And so all of this, as I see it, provides more than enough reason to conclude that when you read something in the Bible, and when you attempt to formulate a belief from that, you are most certainly, you are forming that belief from a particular interpretation of the passage. Stop hitting this microphone, Colby. From your interpretation. Okay, that was the point of the post. That you believe a thing because of an interpretation, not because just that's what the Bible says or that's just what God says. Okay, so that's my not so brief summary of the post from the other day that for the most part, lots of people really resonated with and really appreciated. And that was really fun to see how much that really sort of spoke the language of many people's faith and heart and sort of how they've been thinking and feeling. But there was some pushback, which is to be expected, BT dubs. And for the most part, I welcome pushback. I want pushback. The last thing that I want is to ever become someone's guru or just become another voice in your life where you accept everything I say as real, true, or good. Like, let's just avoid that, please. But so there were some pushback, but and or questions. Some of them I think were in good faith. Others maybe less so. But the point is instead of responding on Instagram or on Facebook, I thought I would try out this medium because I think it allows me to say a bit more than just like my thumbs typing out on my phone. So I'm going to, for the rest of the video here, attempt to expand on and then respond to just 4 of the more common questions and observations that were raised by individuals in response to my post. And if you find this video helpful, I'd love it if you clicked like on the video and or maybe you leave a comment in the section below letting me know what you think. Did you find these responses to people's observations or questions or pushback? Did you find them helpful or interesting? Or do you have other thoughts or questions? Okay, so the first thing is this. Probably the main pushback that came up has to do with like comparing different interpretations. So if the Bible as a source is subject to all sorts of variations and variables that impact translations, and then if we as the readers are also impacted by all sorts of things that affect how we read and understand the Bible, then what do we do with the multiple different ways that this thing gets interpreted? Another way to ask that is, are all interpretations created equal? Now, at best, I really like this line of questioning. Okay. I think this conversation around evaluating and comparing translations and interpretations, I think that's a conversation worth having. So I'm here for that. But then at worst, like on the flip side, this can sometimes kind of devolve into a line of questioning that kind of drives me nuts because some people, when merely the idea is suggested that, look, we're all interpreting the Bible, we're all choosing what to believe based on how we interpret it. For some people, that immediately then just goes to the logical, in their mind at least, the logical conclusion, well, then I guess nothing matters. So let's just do whatever we want with our lives. And that always, like that leap astounds me. Now, in my original post, I did make sure to say, I said, of course, some interpretations are better than others, of course, but that's a discussion for a different day. So here's that different day. Let's start that discussion a little bit. Now, I run into this line of thinking a lot when I start talking about things like the subjectivity inherent to something like the religion of Christianity. Immediately people respond from this place of fear with things like, so you're saying there's no such thing as objective truth? Or they think that they've done some sort of gotcha against me by saying, well, aren't you saying that your interpretation is true and ours is not? So aren't you doing the same thing you're criticizing? And again, I do understand this sort of fear-based response. People have been convinced of a certain thing. People have been convinced by their church, by their parents, by their family of origin, whatever it is, they've been convinced of a certain thing, which is that correct belief is the most important thing to God. And so whenever something gets just even close to challenging that or challenging some of their deeply held beliefs, people's defenses, like understandably, they go up. But let me say this as clearly as I can, okay? Because for some reason, this always gets assumed by those who are sort of the most responding in fear to some of the things that I say. So let me say, yes, and you can tweet me on this. Yes, I believe that such a thing as objective truth and reality exists. Okay? The answer is yes. However, I am increasingly skeptical of not only our capacity to know or to hold objective truth, but I'm also very suspicious that any one person or one religion or one denomination has managed to figure it all out. So yeah, objective truth, it probably exists, okay? But also, how can we ever fully, truly know when we've got it figured out? And how can we know when others do not? So I do suggest that we do our best to walk around humbly, knowing that we might be wrong. And yes, that includes me. I might be wrong, okay? There's no gotcha there. I always say I could be wrong here too. Now, to the point of, further to the point of comparing or evaluating interpretations against each other. Again, I'll say this. No, not all interpretations are created equal. Yes, my operating belief, the way I function in the world, is that some interpretations are better than others. But that raises some follow-up questions. What do we mean by better, and how do we measure that? So here's 3 quick thoughts on that. One is this. One way that an interpretation might be said to be better than another is to talk in terms of which one is closer to the original intent of the author. So imagine that I left the house and I put a note on the counter that said, kids, please clean your bedrooms while I'm gone. And I get back home a few hours later. Now, the child of mine that says, Dad, I read your note and I understood that you wanted me to clean my room, and I have done that. That child, you could say, has interpreted my note better than the one who says, Dad, I read your note and I thought about it. And I realized that technically I don't have a bedroom because I don't own this home or pay rent. So in theory, all the rooms are yours and Mom's. So I didn't clean anything because I don't have a bedroom. Now, child number 2 found a way to legitimately interpret my words, but also entirely miss the intent, the obvious intent of what I, the original author, was communicating. So yeah, sometimes interpretation is better than another because it more closely gets at what the original intent of the author was. But that's not like the end goal of the interpreter. That's not the only move that we have to make here when trying to translate and interpret. When it comes to something like interpreting the Bible, we're not just decoding a book of law. Okay, this isn't just mathematical equations that we just have to sort of piece from these one-to-one movements. We're working with things like poetry and metaphor and letters written in entirely different cultures and contexts. So sometimes it's not just about getting the original intent. Sometimes that is not sufficient. Sometimes not only do we have to try and understand the original meaning of what the author probably meant, but we have to also try and figure out what, if anything, it then means for us or has to do with us today. I'm going to take a drink of water and then give you an example. I'm in my garage right now and it's really hot. So here's an example. In Ephesians 3, verse 6, Paul writes this. Slaves, actually, the minute I said that, I don't think that is Ephesians 3, 6. It might be Ephesians 6, 3. I think anyways. In Ephesians, Paul writes, I'm not going to edit this video, so I'm just going to leave that as it is. Paul writes this somewhere in Ephesians, you find it. Quote, slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Okay, so on one hand, the interpreter that says Paul is admonishing slaves to be obedient to their masters is doing a better job of interpreting in terms of getting at the original intent of the author than the one who suggests that Paul is telling slaves, you got the option. If you want to free yourselves from being under your master's control, you can do that. Okay, so the interpreter that gets closer to the original intent of the author is better in that way. But like in this case, the follow-up is, so what? Who cares if that's a better interpretation as it relates to getting to the closer to the original intent of the author? What exactly has this interpretation gained us? It might be better in one sense, the sense I talked about, but in all other regards, this is a horrendous interpretation. We should be throat punching anyone who is using this verse to like argue the validity or the value of slavery simply on the merits that, well, this is the original intent of the author. Sorry, but that's not a good interpretation of this passage. It's not. So sometimes the better interpretation, and again, that's why I go back to, we have to talk about what we mean when we say better. The better interpretation is not about which one gets closer to the original intent, but it's about which one more accurately understands, you might say, the essence of what was communicated then, why it was communicated, and then how that makes sense in other cultures and other contexts such as ours here today. So I would argue a better interpretation is the one in a passage like this that gets at the heart of what might be happening in this passage and say, okay, clearly we know that slavery is wrong. Okay. So we don't do that ish no more. So what, if anything, is there happening here that would make for a better way to approach this passage than another? Okay. And then the third thing I'll say about comparing different interpretations is how it is that some are obviously better than others. Most of the time, in order to do the first two things that I mentioned, in order to better understand the original intent of the author, and then to more deeply comprehend what's going on so that you might contextualize it, in order to do all that, we have to have an awareness for and an appreciation of the historical, the cultural, and the textual context. Okay? So this is the third way to get a better interpretation is to be aware that this verse or this passage sits within a historical context, in a cultural context, in a textual context within how it sort of fits in the letter or in the whole Bible or whatever. Meaning it's not a very good interpretation, typically speaking, if someone just opens up their English Bible and reads it and tries to interpret it with zero knowledge about Second Temple Judaism, zero insight into rabbinical teaching techniques, knowing nothing about Roman empirical law, knowing nothing about first century apocalyptic preaching, having no concept of extra biblical texts like the Wisdom of Solomon, having no in-depth knowledge of Old Testament prophetic literature, just to name a few things. If someone just reads a few words in English and is like, well, that settles it, I got that one figured out, odds are that interpretation of that passage is not going to be as good as the one that takes all these other factors into consideration to understand things like historical and textual and cultural context. This is why I get so confused, by the way, when people accuse me of thinking that I must somehow be advocating that all interpretations are equal. No, that's part of why I wrote my first book, UnClobber. That's part of what this thing is all about. It's the ways in which I think my interpretations and those who come to similar conclusions as I do are better interpretations than the ones that read the clobber passages and conclude, oh yeah, God's anti-LGBTQ. No, my interpretations are better. Yes. So some interpretations are better than others. Yes, 100%. Okay. So I hope that makes a bit more sense now for the one of the main questions that come up in this or pushback is, so you're just saying that nothing is true and everything is subjective. No, like there are ways to evaluate which interpretations are better than others. Okay, let's move on. The second thing that came up in all this and comes up often, several people push back on how I said in my post that our English Bibles are a translation of a translation of a translation of a translation, which was really just my way of trying to name that, for example, the Gospels were spoken in Aramaic and then translated into written form Greek, and that was eventually translated into Latin, and that was eventually translated into German, which was translated into Old English. And honestly, that may not be the entirely accurate map, so you can correct me if you want, but the gist of the point remains. Like that's what I was talking about, translation. But several people pointed out, and rightly so, thank you for that, that we now have access to and possess not an insignificant amount of manuscripts from the first couple centuries. And so in many regards, we could just say that this is just a English translation of the Greek original. So it's just a translation of a translation. Now, let me say this. Yeah, if our Bibles were just the product of like 2,000 years of the game of telephone, where you just sort of pass on what you hear and by the end point, like it's pretty mucked up from the original. Like if that's what's going on here, then yes, I would think that would put a pretty big dent in like reliability of transmission. But I hear what y'all are saying and I agree with you. That's not necessarily the case of what the Bible is. Because like many of you pointed out, we can compare our translations today with something very close to the original manuscripts. So, I mean, that matters, right? In terms of confidence of reliability, that matters, right? Well, I'd say yes and no. Yes, in that it's certainly better that we have some original Greek manuscripts to compare against. Yep. That allows us to see, for example, where maybe the Greek, Latin, German, Old English track sort of missed the boat on some things and got a little bit confused and muddy. So being able to compare that is better, yes. But also, it's not really that simple. It's not really that simple. You can't just dust off a 2,000-year-old piece of papyri, a Greek manuscript, and then just do a direct translation into English and conclude that we're just good to go. Now we've got, like I said, this sort of unaltered transmission of the mind of God. No. So I'm going to try to, it just doesn't work like that. I'm going to try to explain what I mean. And to do that, I'm going to give you an example. So I'm going to use the Greek word sozo, S-O-Z-O. Now, if you go to a Greek dictionary and just look up the meaning of the word sozo, you're going to find a couple ways that it is often translated. And I got that on the screen there. So to save, to deliver, to protect, to heal, and to be made whole. And it's quite a range of meanings, right? So right off the bat, if you just try and do a one-to-one translation Greek to English, you're going to still have to make some choices, some interpretive choices. In this passage, do you say saved? Do you say rescued? Do you say healed? Do you say be made whole? Okay, so right there, you already have to make a choice. And don't misunderstand me. of course, scholars have methods for trying to determine what sense the author was using a particular word, right? I'm not just suggesting that they put all these English words in a hat and just pull one out and be like, hey guys, for this one, let's go with heal. Ooh, for this one, let's go with save. Okay, that's not the point. I know it's more nuanced and intentional than that. All I'm saying is there is a range of meaning for all sorts of words like this, like sozo. And that alone, I would hope would give us pause in our sense of certainty that every single choice made in translation and interpretation is the exact right one, thereby preserving this exact right meaning across the last 2 millennia. But it goes even deeper than that. And this takes me back to how I said that it's a translation of a translation of a translation, and so on. Because even when we go directly from Greek to English, our English words themselves are products of previous languages such as Latin and French and German and Dutch and even ancient Greek. In every possible translation of sozo, whether it's save or heal or rescue or made whole, each of these words have their own range of meanings and backgrounds and other sort of ideas. So like the word deliver, for example, might have a range of meanings that doesn't totally overlap with sozo. There might be a sense in which sozo means to deliver, but to deliver could also mean these other things in our language that don't necessarily connect to sozo. I'm reminded of my work, if I'm going to go back to UnClobber for a second, in the passages in Leviticus where the Hebrew word tovah gets translated as abomination in our English Bibles. And the problem with that is that our word abomination has concepts and ideas attached to it. Specifically, abomination can mean to be less than human. And that concept, to be less than human, is not present in the word tova. So you have like this Venn diagram of tova and abomination, and out here, less than human is not part of what tova means. So that's why I call abomination a terrible translation. It shouldn't be in our Bible, in my opinion. This is not what the original translators or original authors were saying with tova. But so to go back to sozo for a second then, what I'm saying is that when translators have to pick which one of these words, there will always be the chance then that whatever word they pick will impact that whole passage, will impact that whole story, because whatever word they might pick to translate sozo might take the reader, you and me, in a different direction in our minds. Okay. And then to take it even one more step, religiously in our English language, all of these words have their own kind of history. Meaning, here's an example, what we think of the word salvation or to be saved. Salvation today, I would suggest to you, is vastly different than what a person in first century Palestine would have thought about the idea of salvation. Most Christians today hear the word salvation and they're heavily influenced by like centuries of Catholic theology, which then got slightly altered into Protestant Reformation theology, and then that got super mixed up with images thanks to things like Dante's Inferno, and then fast forward even more to things like Late Great Planet Earth and the Left Behind series. And so most Christians today hear the word salvation, and their minds go to salvation is to be kept from eternal lake of fire when you die. But almost all scholars agree that during Jesus' day, the concept of salvation was wildly different than this. It was much more connected to a sense of being liberated and rescued from earthly oppressors. They weren't walking around thinking about the afterlife, about heaven and hell. They were thinking about the Romans' boot on their neck and wondering, when would God save them? When would God deliver them like he'd done long ago with Moses and Pharaoh? Okay, so yes, take your Greek manuscript that has things like the word sozo, do a one-to-one translation straight to English, but then keep in mind that not only do you have to pick the best word, heal, rescue, made whole, save, but then that those words themselves have been heavily influenced and colored by centuries of theological and cultural ideas. I hope you're starting to pick up a little bit what I'm putting down here. Are you starting to see I want to say how silly it is, but it sounds more pejorative than I intend it to be, but just how silly it is to think that we have this unfettered, unaltered, pure transference of the mind of God into human storytellers, into human authors, through human translators, through multiple centuries and all different kinds of civilizations, through different words and meanings and religious ideas. And somehow all you have to do is just open and read your NIV and you think you can claim to know exactly what God says about a thing? This might be, my friend, what professionals call grandiose delusions. All right, let's move on. The third thing that some folks have responded to this is the idea that, or the suggestion that when they read the Bible, so again, I think this comes from a place of wanting to hold on to the idea that I believe a thing because God says it, and I know that God says it because it's in the Bible. So it's not just my interpretation, it's what God says. What I hear is that they believe that they are basically being divinely guided or protected in their reading and interpreting process. And the sense I get is like, okay, so you're saying that God reaches through all of your subjectivity, bypassing all the things that make you unique and all the different contexts, fiddles with all the knobs on your dashboard to ensure that you receive just a pure transmission of truth. Like that's what you think happens when you read? And I guess my response to that is, okay, sure, maybe. But how in the world would you ever know that that's happening? And furthermore, does it happen every time you read the Bible? And does this happen for other people too? I mean, obviously not, because otherwise we wouldn't have tens of thousands of different religious denominations, and we wouldn't have gallons of bloodshed throughout our religious history over arguing and differences of theological belief. So clearly God doesn't do this divine assurance when reading the Bible for everyone. Or if he does, then she's a bit demented and is out there intentionally causing everyone to crash into each other by fiddling their knobs and turning their levers to give them, I don't know what, assurance that I'm giving you the truth, but I'm also giving your neighbor the truth, but it's actually a slightly different truth, and now you're going to crash. Have fun with that. All right. So anyway, I don't really get how a person would conclude that such a thing happens, like at all. This sort of divine assurance when I'm reading that I've got what is true. I don't really sure how you would ever know that happens, let alone how you'd ever know that it happens to you in particular. Like what makes you so special? No offense. What makes you so special that God would just bypass all of your circuitry and all of your experience and all of your context and all of the biases that you have and just sort of download undiluted truth into your brains? But then what? God doesn't do this for me. God doesn't do this for others. And like, again, how do you know this is happening? Like what gives you that confidence, or where did you even get the idea that that's a thing that happens in the first place? My sense is that at the end of the day, to the person that believes this, I would just say, okay, that's just a choice that you're making. You're just choosing to think that's what's happening. There's really no rational or logical or sensical reason to make that choice. It just is a choice you're making. Okay. You're just choosing to believe that when you read the Bible, that God is protecting you from misunderstanding, that God is preventing you from bad translations and so on. And I guess it's a fine belief. You're welcome to believe it, just so long as you know that you're just choosing to think that. You're just choosing to believe that that's a thing that God does and that it's happening to you. Okay. All right. Finally, the fourth thing is very similar to number 3. Not only do many people just sort of choose to think that when they read the Bible that God is perfectly protecting them from misunderstanding, but probably even more prevalent than that is this belief that God acted divinely throughout time and space to protect and preserve the truth of the Bible, all the way from inspiration to authorship to transmission to writing it down to the translation, to keeping the manuscripts safe, and to ensure that all subsequent translations were accurate and shielded from mistakes and so on. In short, this idea that God has guided and orchestrated the whole process of getting the Bible from the heavens into your hands today. The picture that comes to mind for me when I think about this is, that old Disney movie, Angels in the Outfield, where the players are like literally snagged by angels and dragged across the field to make catches that they wouldn't have gotten otherwise. Like the idea is that we humans were like perpetual toddlers that God has baby proofed the last 2,000 years to make sure that God's words and ideas never got broken or tampered with. Let me just carry everybody along and make sure that this thing never has any mistakes or goes awry. It's a neat idea. I'll grant you that. And I think there was a time in my life where I probably believed something along those lines. But just like what I said a minute ago, at the end of the day, I kind of just see this as a choice that someone is deciding to believe. There's no real reason to think this has happened or to think that it's happening. Even those who claim to have all their beliefs founded in the Bible, I mean, there's no Bible verse that says, "And henceforth forevermore the words written herein shall be protected and preserved by the Spirit of the Lord, kept from all errors and translations or future contradiction." Like that, obviously there's nothing like that. So you're just sort of choosing to think, oh, I bet God has just acted divinely to ensure that this whole process has gone smoothly and perfectly. And every translation choice is the right one, right? Every choice of sozo into the English is the right one always. But again, we have so many different translations. So which one got carried by the angels in the outfield and which one got left behind? Oh, I wish we'd all been ready. So anyway, so here's the thing. Next time, so I say this to the people who think that way, or to people who interact with people who think like this. Next time someone suggests to you that the Holy Spirit not only perfectly inspired the writing of the Bible, but then protected it all throughout the various copying and translating, just ask them, well, why do you think that? Why do you think that? Well, because it's God's holy word. Okay, fine. But like, why do you think God protected and preserved it? Like you're saying, like what gives you that sense? Where did that idea even come from? And what you'll discover is there's really no answer to that question. It's just, again, it's a choice they're making, and it's fine. Make the choice, but you just know that you're just choosing to think that thing happened. And again, if I were to make a guess as to where this comes from, it comes from this assumption, perhaps, that God is most concerned with what humans believe. That God is most concerned that we get theological answers correct. And so therefore, I guess it's reasonable to conclude that God would preserve truth for all time to make sure that we have capital T truth. And I think that's a lot of assumptions. It's a lot of guesswork along the way to get there. As I see it, at least, and I write about this quite a bit in my second book, The Shift. I'll put a link somewhere. I write about this, like there's no real good reason to think that what God cares about most is what we believe. I mean, just a quick example is to think about how Jesus taught. His primary teaching method was to use parables. Really confusing, hard to understand parables. So clearly he wasn't about just, let's get people to believe the right things. Let's prepare them to answer the most important test of their life when they die. Like nowhere do we really get the impression that God's biggest concern is the transmission of, and therefore the protection of, correct belief. And then I'll also add that there are a lot of good reasons to think that God most certainly has not protected or preserved what you might call the original words and the meaning of what we now call the Bible. Like there's a lot of reasons to think that actually clearly hasn't happened. Again, I would point you to the extreme diversity within the last 2,000 years of the Christian religion, from Greek Orthodox to Russian Orthodox to Roman Catholic to Eastern Orthodox to Lutherans and Presbyterians and the Church of England and Episcopalians and Nazarenes and Baptists and Pentecostals and all the many different variations of non-denomination churches. Each one of those and all the others, which clearly I could take an hour listing them all, each one harbors this kind of institutional insistence that they and they alone are the one strand that God chose to preserve the truth. Like, just stop and think about how absurd that is. So if your conviction is that God somehow protected and preserved all the various moments of translation and interpretation and protected and guided the interpreters when they were reading it, then which version of Christianity are you prepared to say is the right one? Which is the one that God chose to protect and preserve? Do you see what I'm saying? And then another thought here is how, gosh, you can just look at the way like the Bible contradicts itself. I point this out often, like the Gospels themselves often don't agree on how a thing was said or when an event took place or who was there or how it happened. So then, like, how can you with a straight face maintain that God was acting to protect and preserve the true transmission of what really happened when Matthew and Mark and Luke disagree? Like, which one is the version that God protected and preserved? And how can you know? How can you know? I was interacting with one person about all this the other day, and they were saying that they often run into this kind of thinking with their more fundamentalist-minded people in their life. And they said that their friends and family will look at her and in a conversation like this, and they'll say, well, isn't your God big enough to keep the oral and the written scriptures perfect throughout time and across culture? Like, you get what they're saying, right? Like, if God created the cosmos, then how hard would it be for God to just sort of preserve truth throughout 2,000 years of different cultures and contexts and translations, et cetera? Isn't your God big enough to do that? And I suggested that she respond with, well, isn't your God big enough to not care if finite humans get a few things wrong here and there? And that's where I'll end this response video, if you will, or this sort of follow-up video. The idea that we can just pick up the Bible today and have 100% confidence that it will deliver to us this pure transference of the mind of God because we've decided to believe that God has preserved and ensured for 2,000 years that this truth is just magically kept safe from any outside tainting or alteration. Like, it sounds nice and lovely and it warms the heart to think of. Like, it makes you think like you're doing the race with the little egg on the spoon and you're running fast and you just always got God on your left and your right to make sure that like, it feels really nice to feel like just constantly protected, like nothing will ever affect that. It sounds good, but it just doesn't make any sense. It really doesn't make any sense. And it doesn't hold up to scrutiny. It doesn't hold up to scholarship. But it's just not, it's not what this thing is about. It's not what it's about. It's not what it's about. All right. So that about covers it. Nope, I don't want to go back to that. My bad. That pretty much covers what I wanted to share. As I've been sitting with this post for the last couple weeks and reading everybody's responses and questions. And I want to thank everyone who shared the post. I want to thank everyone who interacted with it, who commented on it. Thanks to all of you who loved it and said kind things. And thanks to you who asked questions and challenged me and pushed back. I really appreciate that. I'd love to know what you think about my responses here to these 4 common criticisms or questions or pushbacks. If you want to leave something in the comment section below, I'd love to know. And if something came up for you in all this that I didn't address, leave that question down below as well. And I'll see if I might address that at some point as well. Okay, that's it. I love you all. Have a great day. Bye.